At dawn, the city should smell of bread and wet stone. Instead, the air tastes metallic, like a coin held too long on the tongue. A church bell rings once, then again. Then it does not stop. In a narrow street, shutters stay closed though the sun is up. A dog noses at a bundle by a doorway and whines. Inside one house, a woman wakes to the sound of her husband coughing. Deep, tearing coughs that scrape the chest. When he turns toward her, she sees the swelling at his groin, tight and blackened beneath the skin, as if the body itself has decided to mark him. He tries to stand. He cannot. His breath shortens, counted like coins slipping through fingers. Outside, carts roll not toward the market, but away from it, wheels groaning under a new kind of cargo. Cloth is tied over mouths. A priest murmurs words he has already said too many times today. Somewhere, a child cries until no one answers. The city is still alive, barely, but its rhythms are wrong. Bakers do not open. Apprentices do not report. The soundscape thins. Fewer footsteps, fewer voices, more bells. Windows become borders. Touch becomes suspect. Even air feels shared too closely. By noon, rumors travel faster than feet. The sickness kills in days, sometimes hours. It chooses without reason. The strong fall beside the frail. A man collapses mid-prayer, another mid-laugh. No poultice works. No prayer guarantees mercy. Physicians argue over vapors and stars, while bodies stack in corners where the light cannot reach. And then comes the quiet, the kind that arrives not because peace has been achieved, but because too many mouths have closed. This is not a war. There is no enemy to face, no treaty to sign, no wall to hold. The threat moves with breath and trade and love. It rides in the seams of everyday life. If a city is a body, streets as veins, markets as hearts, faith as breath, what happens when the blood turns against itself? When the system that made prosperity possible becomes the engine of extinction? Is this the end of the world, or the beginning of a different one? What followed between 1347 and 1351 was not merely a plague, it was a rupture in the human story. Across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, the disease we now call the Black Death killed an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the population. Some regions lost more. Some towns vanished entirely, their names surviving only in tax rolls and monastery margins. These numbers are estimates, and scholars still debate their exact scale, but all agree on the outcome. Nothing like this had ever happened before, and nothing afterward would look the same. The Black Death did not just empty houses, it shattered assumptions. Labor, once cheap and endless, became scarce and powerful. Faith, once unquestioned, was strained under the weight of unanswered prayers. States discovered both their fragility and their capacity to intervene. Old hierarchies cracked. New fears and new possibilities entered the bloodstream of society. This was a disaster that rewrote the balance between life and power, between the individual and the system. And it did so not at the margins, but at the center of a world that believed it was finally stable. To understand how a single pathogen could redraw civilization, we must first step back into the world as it existed just before the bells would not stop ringing. On the eve of the Black Death, Europe believed it was standing on solid ground. The climate had been relatively mild for generations, allowing harvests to expand and populations to grow. Villages pushed into forests, fields climbed hillsides. By the early 14th century, towns were swelling with people, noise, and ambition. Stone walls rose. Cathedrals stretched upward, their spires declaring confidence in both God and human craft. Trade stitched the continent together. Wool from England, wine from France, silver from Central Europe, spices and silks from the East. All moved along routes that were older than memory but busier than ever. Ports thrummed with activity. Markets operated on credit and trust. Money changed hands faster than land. Technology, modest by modern standards, felt transformative then. Watermills ground grain. Windmills drained marshes. Better plows cut deeper into stubborn soils. Paper, still rare, began to circulate knowledge more cheaply than parchment. Universities taught medicine, law, and theology with renewed authority. The world felt explainable, even improvable. Above all, there was faith in order. God governed the cosmos. Kings ruled by divine sanction. Disease, famine, and war were familiar visitors, but they came and went. They were punishments, yes, but also tests. The system had endured them before. Yet beneath this confidence lay strain. Fields were overworked. Cities were crowded beyond sanitation. The poor pressed closer to the walls of the rich. When weather turned bad, as it had in the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, hunger spread fast. The world was full of people, of connections, of certainty. And fullness, as history would soon reveal, can be a dangerous thing. The very forces that lifted medieval society now sharpened the blade against it. Trade routes were arteries of wealth, carrying grain, cloth, and silver across continents. But they also carried stowaways, rats nesting in sacks, fleas hiding in seams, pathogens moving invisibly with every transaction. A ship that arrived full meant profit.
I'll give you 3.
It also meant contact, and contact meant risk. Cities, once symbols of progress, became amplifiers. Narrow streets trapped waste. Shared wells mixed water and illness. People slept close, worked closer, prayed closest of all. What had once been efficiency became exposure. A single cough could ripple through a neighborhood in days. War added another edge. Armies marched not only with steel, but with hunger and disease, displacing civilians and stressing food systems already near their limits. Fortified towns opened gates for soldiers and traders alike, blurring any line between defense and invitation. Even belief played its part. Trust in divine order encouraged acceptance, sometimes delay. If sickness was a test, then endurance mattered more than escape. If it was punishment, then repentance mattered more than quarantine. The idea of isolating the sick, of breaking social bonds to preserve life, was still alien, even cruel. Prosperity had made the world fast, dense, and confident. It had woven humanity into a single, humming network. And networks, once poisoned at the source, do not fail quietly. They fail everywhere at once. The Black Death did not begin in Europe. It arrived there, carried by forces already in motion. Far to the east, in the vast grasslands and trade hubs of Central Asia, ecosystems were shifting. Climate fluctuations altered rainfall and temperatures, changing the balance between rodents, fleas, and the bacteria that lived within them, Yersinia pestis. In these regions, plague was not new. It smoldered quietly among wild animals, flaring when conditions aligned. Those conditions did align in the early 14th century. The Mongol Empire, though fragmenting, had recently stitched Eurasia together under a single commercial horizon. Caravans moved with unprecedented safety from China to the Black Sea. Silk, spices, and precious metals flowed west. So did news, ideas, and disease. The Silk Road was not a line, but a web, and plague slipped through its knots. In the trading cities of the Crimea, where Italian merchants maintained fortified ports, the disease found its bridge to the Mediterranean. Grain ships waited in harbors. Sailors slept below decks. Rats thrived in darkness and damp. Fleas leaping host to host as easily as stories crossed languages. By the time symptoms appeared, the journey was already complete. The pathogen had learned to travel faster than fear. What began as a local ecological imbalance had become a global event, long before the word global existed. And then came the moment when history, legend, and horror converged into a single, unforgettable scene. The year is 1346. The place is the port city of Kaffa on the Black Sea. Behind its walls, Genoese merchants watch the horizon with unease. Outside, a Mongol army has laid siege, tents stretching like a second city across the plain. War here is familiar. Disease is not, until bodies begin to fall in the enemy camp. Men grow feverish. Dark swellings bloom beneath their skin. Death comes quickly, and it comes often. The attackers panic. They pray.
Cast off
They
the
retreat
stern
from the
line.
sick.
Make sail,
And then,
men.
in desperation or calculation, they turn the dead into weapons. According to contemporary accounts, the Mongols load plague-ridden corpses into their catapults and hurl them over Kaffa's walls. The bodies burst on impact. Blood and decay smear the stone. The air fills with a smell that no wind can carry away. Inside the city, fear becomes immediate and physical. Merchants seal themselves indoors. Servants flee. Rats scatter from the rotting remains. Fleas seeking new hosts in a city not prepared for what they carry. Soon, Kaffa is sick. Ships do what ships have always done when danger arrives by land. They leave. Genoese vessels slip their moorings and head for Constantinople, Messina, Venice, and beyond. Sailors carry more than cargo in their holds. They carry an invisible passenger that does not require food, water, or permission. Whether or not the catapulted corpses truly started the plague in Europe is still debated by historians. But as a symbol, the moment is undeniable. War, trade, and disease have fused into one. And once set in motion, the chain cannot be recalled. From the Black Sea, the plague moves like a shadow cast by commerce. In 1347, ships reach Constantinople, then Messina. Sailors stagger ashore already dying, their bodies marked by fever and swelling. Some ports try to refuse entry, others hesitate. Trade is life, and refusal means ruin. In most cases, the decision comes too late. Rats disembark unnoticed. Fleas find new warmth. The disease takes root. By early 1348, the Mediterranean becomes a corridor of death. Marseille, Genoa, Venice, Barcelona. Each city experiences the same pattern. A few unexplained deaths, then clusters, then collapse. Bells ring constantly. Graves fill. When burial grounds overflow, bodies are layered like firewood. From the ports, the plague follows roads inland. Merchants carry it to fairs. Pilgrims carry it to shrines. Armies carry it to borders. In Paris, London, Florence, and Vienna, the disease rewrites the calendar. Weeks blur into funerals. Spring brings no relief. By 1349, it reaches the British Isles and Scandinavia. In some villages, everyone dies. In others, a handful survive and remember silence where voices once lived. The speed is unprecedented. Within 4 years, nearly the entire known world of Europe is touched. Distance no longer protects. Isolation is an illusion. This is not a wave that crashes and retreats. It is a tide that keeps rising, finding every inlet, every weakness in the map. As death becomes routine, society begins to fail in layers. First, the markets. Bakers die. Millers flee. Grain rots in storehouses because no one dares to open them. Prices spike, then lose meaning altogether. Money cannot buy bread if there is no one left to bake it. Then, the law. Courts close when judges fall ill. Contracts dissolve with their signatories. Prisons empty, not by mercy, but by neglect. In some cities, watchmen abandon their posts. In others, harsh edicts appear, orders that cannot be enforced because there are too few hands to enforce them. Medicine collapses next. Physicians, trained in ancient authorities, argue over humors and bad air, while patients die in their beds. Some doctors refuse to visit the sick. Others charge fortunes for remedies that do nothing. Hospitals overflow, becoming places where one goes not to heal, but to die faster. Ritual follows. Funerals shrink, then vanish. Priests cannot keep pace with the dead. Mass graves open on the edges of cities. Bodies are wrapped quickly, sometimes not at all. The final words that once marked a good death are swallowed by urgency. A city is more than stone and walls. It is timing, trust, repetition. When those fail, the city stops functioning as a living thing. The Black Death does not just kill people, it kills coordination. And in that vacuum, fear takes control. Faced with an enemy they could not see, people reached for the tools they had. Physicians consulted ancient texts. They blamed corrupted air, imbalanced humors, unlucky planetary alignments. Treatments followed the logic of the age. Bloodletting to restore balance, aromatic herbs to cleanse the lungs, fires lit in streets to purify the atmosphere. None stopped the disease, but all offered the comfort of action. Religion became both refuge and burden. Others organized processions, singing through the streets, believing collective repentance might move divine mercy. Some prayed harder, crowding churches in desperate hope. For a few, faith fractured. If God ruled justly, why did children die first? Why did monks fall beside sinners? Authorities experimented. Cities like Milan tried walling off infected houses, leaving the sick and the healthy trapped together inside. In some cases, it slowed the spread. In others, it deepened suffering. Travel bans appeared. Ships were turned away. Isolation, still unnamed, began to take shape through instinct rather than science. Individuals adapted faster than institutions. Families fled to the countryside. The wealthy sealed themselves behind gates. Those who remained learned new habits, avoiding touch, avoiding crowds, avoiding hope. Trust narrowed to the smallest possible circle. None of these responses were foolish. They were human. They represented minds working at the edge of knowledge, trying to impose meaning on chaos. But when fear outpaces understanding, it seeks simpler answers and simpler targets. When explanations failed, blame filled the void. Across parts of Europe, fear hardened into suspicion, and suspicion turned toward those already standing at the margins. Rumors spread that the plague was no accident, that it was caused, planted, engineered by hidden enemies. Wells were said to be poisoned. Bread was said to be cursed. Whispers moved faster than facts ever could.
You cannot enter.
Jewish communities became frequent targets of this terror. Accusations, entirely false and fueled by centuries of prejudice, erupted into violence. Entire neighborhoods were burned. Families were tortured into confessions scripted by fear. In cities from Strasbourg to Basel, massacres were carried out in the name of protection, even as the disease continued to spread indiscriminately among the accusers themselves. These acts did nothing to stop the plague. They only added murder to mortality. Elsewhere, extremist religious movements emerged. Groups of flagellants marched from town to town, publicly whipping themselves, believing pain could purchase salvation for a sinful world. Their processions drew crowds that helped the disease travel further. Authorities eventually banned them, recognizing that desperation, when organized, could become another vector of collapse. It is crucial to say this plainly. These violences were not inevitable. They were choices, born of terror, ignorance, and long-held bias. The plague did not create hatred, but it stripped away restraints that once kept it in check. In moments when societies feel cornered, the instinct to simplify, to divide the world into pure and impure, can become lethal. And even as cities tore themselves apart from within, the disaster continued its quiet work beyond their walls. The countryside did not escape. It absorbed the shock differently. At first, rural villages believed distance would protect them. The air was cleaner, houses were spaced apart. Life moved to the rhythm of seasons, not bells, but roads connect fields to towns, and towns to ports. Grain carts arrived, tax collectors followed, priests traveled between parishes. The plague came with them.
This way, I am certain.
When it did,
The road to the
the
left
effects
seems less
cut
traveled.
deep.
But the map said the
Farm
woods
families
further
were
east.
small, and every pair
I
of
don't like
hands
this place.
mattered. A single death could mean an unharvested field. Several deaths meant abandonment. Oxen wandered untended. Crops stood ready and then rotted, untouched, as if the land itself had been forgotten. Manors lost tenants, lords lost rents. In some regions, entire estates fell silent, reclaimed slowly by grass and animals. Forests crept back over cleared land. Wolves returned to places they had not roamed in generations. Borders blurred. With authority weakened, movement increased. Survivors drifted in search of work or food, carrying stories, grief, and sometimes the disease itself. Old obligations, serfdom, fixed rents, inherited duties, began to feel negotiable when death had already broken every other contract. The plague revealed something uncomfortable. Rural life was not a backup system. It was part of the same fragile network, dependent on people remaining alive, predictable, and present. When those conditions failed, the countryside did not simply endure. It transformed, slowly, unevenly, and with consequences that would reshape Europe for centuries. By the early 1350s, the bells began to ring less often. Not because the plague had been defeated, but because it had run out of easy paths. The disease burned through dense populations first, exhausting the most connected cities and trade hubs. Those who remained were fewer, more cautious, and often scattered. Houses stood empty, roads quieted. The very networks that once accelerated transmission were broken by death itself. Behavior changed. People avoided crowds instinctively. Travel slowed. Some ports enforced longer waiting periods for ships, an early form of quarantine born not from theory but from bitter experience. Isolation, once unthinkable, became a survival strategy. There may have been biological shifts as well. Survivors likely carried partial immunity, not absolute protection, but enough to blunt the deadliest edges. Flea and rat populations fluctuated with climate and food supply. Cooler periods may have disrupted the chain just enough to reduce transmission. Importantly, the Black Death did not vanish. It receded. Plague would return in waves for centuries, smaller but persistent, a reminder that the relationship between humans and disease had permanently changed. The catastrophe eased not through victory, but through attrition, through a world thinned, altered, and painfully aware of its limits. When the dust settled, Europe stood in the quiet aftermath of something vast. And in that quiet, new futures began to take shape. The Black Death did not end the Middle Ages overnight, but it bent history onto a new course. With labor suddenly scarce, the value of work rose. Survivors demanded higher wages, better terms, and mobility. In England and parts of Western Europe, laws tried, and largely failed, to freeze wages and bind workers to land. Power had shifted, quietly but irreversibly, toward those who could still lift a tool or harvest a field. Feudal bonds weakened. Some collapsed. Others transformed into contracts rather than obligations. Land changed hands. Empty properties were consolidated. In cities, guilds tightened their grip, while new families rose where old lineages had ended in silence. Culturally, the trauma etched itself into art and imagination. Skeletons danced with the living in murals and manuscripts. The dance macabre reminded viewers that death did not discriminate. Tombs became more personal, more urgent, carved with faces that demanded to be remembered. Time itself felt sharper, less infinite. Faith adapted as well. The authority of the church was shaken, not destroyed, but questioned. If salvation could not be guaranteed, then conscience, charity, and individual piety mattered more. Seeds of reform were planted long before they would bear names. States, too, learned. Record-keeping improved. Public health measures, rudimentary but intentional, emerged. The idea that governments had a role in managing life, not just ruling land, took root. From mass death came structural change, not progress in any simple sense, but momentum. Europe did not recover its old world. It built a different one on top of the graves. The Black Death feels distant. Its carts, its bells, its mass graves sealed under centuries of stone. Yet its logic is familiar. A world tightly connected. A system optimized for speed and profit. A threat that moves faster than understanding. Today, we know the names of microbes. We map genomes. We count cases in real time. But the questions remain strikingly similar. When does movement become danger? When does faith collide with evidence? And how much isolation can a society endure to save itself? The Black Death reminds us that collapse is rarely caused by a single factor. It emerges when strength turns brittle, when the networks that feed us, enrich us, and link us also carry our undoing. It teaches that fear, when left unexamined, can be as destructive as disease itself. History does not repeat, but it does rhyme. And in that rhyme is a warning written not in ink, but in absence. In empty houses, quiet roads, and names never spoken again. If a civilization is judged not only by how it thrives, but by how it responds when breath itself becomes dangerous, then the past is not finished with us yet. The Black Death ended a world so that another could begin.